Greetings, everyone. Before we begin, I'd love to know where and what time you're listening from. Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy our stories, leave a like and subscribe so you never miss one. Now, turn off the lights, close your eyes, and relax. The exhaustion was an ocean, and we were drowning in it. The first weeks of Nico's life, our newborn son, were nothing like what the glossy magazines promised. They were a brutal endurance test. My wife, Sarah, was pale, her eyes ringed with dark bruises that made her look like a stranger. I wasn't any better. We drifted through the house like ghosts, taking silent shifts, our lives reduced to the relentless cycle of feeding, changing, and rocking a baby who seemed to cry without end. Sleep deprivation was a thick fog that blurred my thoughts, making the real world feel distant and smudged. We had moved into that house on the outskirts just a month before Nico was born. We wanted quiet, a yard and clean air. The place was old, 2 stories, an overgrown garden, and a basement the realtor swore we should keep sealed because of dampness. We got it absurdly cheap, and now I realized why. The house carried a cold that never left, a chill that clung to clothes and seemed to seep up from the foundation itself. But we were too tired to care. Our only tether to sanity was the baby monitor. A high-end unit, night vision, temperature sensor, crystal clear audio. It was a Wi-Fi model, top of the line, hooked into the house's ancient wiring. The realtor had said the electrical was old but functional, maybe too functional. The tiny camera was mounted on the wall above Nico's crib, always watching. The handheld receiver stayed with us, on the kitchen counter, the living room coffee table, our nightstand. It was our electronic eye and ear, our lone sentinel through the long nights. The first time it happened, I blamed pure exhaustion. It was 3 a.m, my watch. Sarah slept the heavy sleep of the depleted beside me. I sat in a chair staring at the screen. The image was grainy green and gray, ghostly. Nico lay still in his crib, a small lump under the blanket. Then the crying started. It burst from the speaker, sharp, piercing, full of anguish. My son's cry. I shot up, heart slamming with adrenaline. I ran down the dark hallway to Nico's room, shoved the door open, ready to scoop him up, to soothe him. But the room was silent. I froze in the doorway. Only the faint glow of the nightlight. I stepped to the crib. Nico was asleep. Deeply asleep. His breathing slow, his face calm. He hadn't cried. He was dry, warm, at peace. I looked at the camera on the wall, its red pilot light glowing like a malevolent eye. Then at the receiver I had left on the bedroom chair. What had I heard? I went back. Sarah had stirred. She asked what was wrong. I told her I thought I heard Nico, but it was a false alarm. She mumbled something about phantom cries and how new parents' brains play cruel tricks. I nodded. It was the only logical explanation. I was so tired my mind was inventing the sound I feared most. But the explanation did not bring peace. I sat back in the chair, eyes on the screen. The baby slept on. But the silence in the house no longer felt calm. It felt watchful. A couple nights later it happened again. This time Sarah was awake, nursing. I was in the kitchen getting her water. The audio unit sat silent on the counter. Then the cry came, same desperate wail, gone in 3 seconds. I bolted to the bedroom. Sarah looked up, confused. Nico had fallen asleep in her arms, peaceful. I asked if she had heard it. She frowned. Heard what? She was less than 10 feet from the receiver. How could she not have heard? I said the device went off again. She picked it up, tapped it lightly. Said it must be interference, maybe picking up a neighbor's signal. But we lived on the edge of nowhere. The nearest house was over half a mile away. I became obsessed with the unit, carried it everywhere, listened constantly. The empty cry grew erratic. Sometimes a second, sometimes 10. Always when I glanced at the screen and saw Nico sleeping, and Sarah never heard it. Only me. Then the crying shifted location. One afternoon I was trying to unpack the living room, sorting through moving boxes we still had not touched. Sarah and Nico were out for a walk. The house was empty for the first time in weeks. I had the audio unit with me out of habit. The silence was total. Then I heard it, not from the receiver, from the house. Faint, muffled but unmistakable, a baby's cry. I went still. The sound came from below, from the hallway off the kitchen. I moved slowly. The cry continued, a pitiful whimper. I reached the end of the hall. There was the basement door, sealed with an old rusted padlock. The sound was coming from behind it. I pressed my ear to the cold wood. The cry was clear now, undeniable. A baby was crying in the basement, a baby that was not mine. I stumbled back, terror tripping me. I sat on the hallway floor, staring at the door as the cry went on for nearly a minute before cutting off, like someone had flipped a switch. When Sarah and Nico returned, I was pale, shaking. She saw the fear in my face. I told her what I had heard. This time she believed me, or at least believed I believed it. We decided to open the door. The lock was ancient. I broke it with a hammer. We pulled it open. A wave of damp, earthy rot mixed with something sickly sweet rose from the dark. I turned on my phone's flashlight and aimed it down. Stone stairs descended into absolute blackness. We went down a few steps. The basement was flooded. A foot of black, stagnant water covered the floor, reflecting my light like shattered glass. Nothing down there. Just rotting wooden crates floating rusted junk. No baby. No source for the sound. We closed the door. Sarah hugged me. She said old houses make weird noises, pipes groan, water echoes can sound like anything. She said we needed sleep. That exhaustion was driving us both insane. I nodded, but I knew it was not pipes. That night, the real terror began. The crying stopped. No more empty wails. Silence ruled. I was on watch 4 a.m. Sarah slept. I stared at the video feed. Nico slept in his crib. The room was still, bathed in that sickly green-gray infrared glow. Then I saw the door to Nico's room open. Slowly, silently. I held my breath. A figure appeared in the doorway. My heart stopped. It was Sarah. I recognized her nightgown, the shape of her hair in the dark. She stepped inside, walked with slow, stealthy steps to the crib, and stood there. My first thought was relief. She had woken to check on him, maternal instinct, but she did not move, just stood, bent over the crib, staring down at Nico. A minute passed, then 2. She did not touch him, did not adjust the blanket, just stared, an unnatural stillness like a statue in a nightmare. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Sarah," I whispered, as if she could hear me through the device. "What are you doing?" She remained frozen. The image was horrifying. The mother, a statue over her sleeping child in ghostly light. Then I heard a whisper beside me. I whipped my head around. Sarah stood in our bedroom doorway, less than 6 feet away, awake, rubbing her eyes. Her voice was thick with sleep. "Javier, what's wrong? Why do you look so pale?" My brain could not process it. I looked at my real wife, flesh and blood, standing there, then back at the screen in my hand. On the feed, the other Sarah, the figure in Nico's room, was still there, bent over the crib. I looked at the real Sarah. She stared, confused. I looked at the screen, and the figure on the feed, the apparition, the thing wearing my wife's face, slowly lifted its head, turned its pale face to the camera, and smiled, a smile impossibly wide, splitting its face in 2, a grotesque mask that had nothing to do with my wife. It knew I was watching. The receiver slipped from my hand, thudding onto the carpet. Panic was an ice needle in my brain. My eyes darted from the grinning thing on the screen to my real wife in the doorway, wrapped in her robe, face etched with confusion and fatigue. Sarah asked what was wrong, why I was looking at her like that, her voice rough from sleep. I could not speak, could not show her the screen. If she saw that inhuman smile wearing her face, she would break. I lunged for the device on the floor and killed the feed. I lied. Said I had dozed off in the chair and had a nightmare. Said I saw a shadow in Nico's room, a huge spider on the wall, anything. My voice cracked, frantic, unconvincing. She looked at me with growing alarm, not for the house, but for me. She begged me to come back to bed, said exhaustion was destroying us. I nodded, speechless. She sighed, too tired to fight, and went back to bed, but I could not rest. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I had to check. I waited until Sarah's breathing deepened. I slipped out silently, walked the freezing hallway to Nico's room, pushed the door open. The room was cold. The smell, the same as the basement, wet earth, sweet rot. Faint, but there, thick around the crib. I approached. Nico slept deeply, just as I had seen on the screen, oblivious. The room was empty. The Sarah thing was gone. I checked the window, locked. The closet, only baby clothes, nothing. But the cold and the smell were undeniable. It had been here. I returned to our bedroom. Sarah slept. I picked up the device from the floor. The screen was intact. With shaking hands, I turned it back on. The feed returned. Normal. Green-gray light showed Nico in his empty crib. No one there. I sat in the chair, watching, receiver in my lap. Had I imagined it? Was it a hallucination born of sleep deprivation and waking dread? Sarah's explanation about exhaustion was so rational, so comforting. I wanted to believe her. I wanted, with every fiber of my being, to be losing my mind from lack of sleep. I spent the rest of the night staring at the screen, paranoia swelling with every minute. Every shadow in Nico's room seemed to shift. Every pixel of static looked like a face. But it did not return. The next day was torture. Sarah was quiet, distant. She watched me when she thought I was not looking. I had scared her, but not for the right reason. The demon had pulled off its first masterstroke. It had not attacked me. It had made my wife doubt my sanity. I felt utterly alone. I tried to act normal, but I could not. Every time I looked at Sarah, I searched for something. A blink too slow, a smile too stiff. I started to suspect her. Could she be sleepwalking? Had she gone to the room and forgotten? Or was the thing using her? That afternoon, while Sarah warmed a bottle in the kitchen, she started humming. A strange, dissonant tune. 3 notes repeating in a rhythm that made no sense. I asked what the song was. She stopped, confused. Said she did not know, that it was stuck in her head and would not leave. First time she had heard it. But not for me. I had heard that same melody before, faint, woven into the empty cries from the basement. The entity was planting thoughts in her mind, just as it was planting them in mine. That night I refused to sleep. I told Sarah I would take watch. She argued, said we had to rotate, that I was on the edge of collapse. But my insistence was so wild, so desperate. She backed down, scared, and locked herself in the bedroom. I was alone in the living room, the baby monitor my only companion. The house was silent. For hours, nothing. Just the quiet image of Nico sleeping. I started to relax. Maybe daylight, normalcy, had driven it away. Then, past midnight, I heard the cry again. Weak, muffled, coming from the basement, rising through the floor. I went to the basement door off the kitchen hallway, pressed my ear to it. There it was, the cry. And now, mixed in, the humming. The same dissonant tune Sarah had been singing. I ran back to the living room, blood frozen. I looked at the screen. The image of Nico's room flickered. The screen filled with white static for a second, a high-pitched whine. Then the picture changed. It was not Nico's room anymore. It was the basement. Grainy green-black footage showed the stone stairs descending into stagnant water. The camera was not down there. The device was pulling a signal that should not exist. The image shook, but it was clear. And then I saw it. Something floated in the center of the black water. An old wooden cradle rotted, covered in algae, and it was rocking. By itself, the image jumped, static, then back to Nico's room. Calm, silent. The baby slept. I collapsed onto the couch, trembling. The thing was tied to the house, to the device, to us. I decided I could not leave Nico alone. If the entity wanted to hurt him, it would have to go through me. I grabbed the screen and went to his room, sat in the rocking chair in the corner watching. I no longer trusted technology. I would guard him myself. Sarah heard me enter. She came to the hallway, saw me sitting in the dark, staring at the crib, her face filled with fear and pity. "Javier, this is insane," she pleaded. "You are scaring the baby. You are scaring me." I told her to leave. Said I was fine, just wanted to make sure he slept. My voice sounded foreign. She stepped back, tears in her eyes, returned to the bedroom. I heard the soft click of the lock. She shut me out. I was alone with my son and the thing stalking the house. An hour passed. The room was freezing. The basement smell was overwhelming. Nico stirred in the crib but did not wake. I stayed in the rocker, watching. The device sat on the dresser across from me, its screen showing the same room I was in. A useless loop of surveillance. I heard a creak in the hallway, looked at the door. It was closed, but then the click of our bedroom lock turning. Sarah. She had gotten up. Her soft footsteps approached. The door to Nico's room opened. It was Sarah, standing in the doorway lit by the hallway light. "Javier, this cannot go on," she said, her voice trembling with exhaustion and fear. "Come back to bed, please." I was about to argue, about to scream that the thing was real, but then my eyes flicked to the screen on the dresser. It showed the room, the crib, the rocker I sat in, and Sarah standing in the doorway. But the screen showed something else, something not in the real room. Behind the real Sarah in the hallway was another figure, the other Sarah, the apparition, standing right behind my wife, smiling. That inhuman, too-wide grin glowed on the screen. And slowly on the screen, I watched the apparition raise its pale hands and place them on the real Sarah's shoulders like a puppeteer. My real wife, unaware, saw the raw terror on my face. She turned quickly. "Javier, what are you looking at?" "There is no one there," she said. She turned back to me. "Javier, there is nothing. You are losing it." Sarah was crying now, afraid of me. She backed into the hallway, and on the screen I saw the smiling apparition follow, hands still on her shoulders, guiding her. I stood. The thing was not after Nico. It was using Sarah, using me. I ran into the hallway to find Sarah there, retreating from me. Behind her, nothing. The apparition vanished the moment I left the room. Sarah screamed as I approached. She ran to our bedroom, but did not lock it. She grabbed Nico from the crib, held him tight. "Javier, stay away from us. You are scaring us." I stopped. The woman I loved looked at me like I was the monster, and the demon, wherever it was, had won. It had isolated me completely, turned me into the threat. I stood alone in the hallway. Sarah had locked herself in Nico's room with our son. I heard the baby cry, frightened by our shouting, and I heard my own, a dry, silent sob. I went back to the living room. The baby monitor was still on the table. I picked it up. The screen was full of static. Then the image cleared. Sharp, clean. The basement, the rotted wooden cradle rocked. The empty cry filled the room loud and clear. And now the dissonant humming joined it, loud and triumphant. I stood frozen in the living room, listening to the triumphant wail pouring from the device. Sarah was locked in Nico's room, terrified of me. The demon had not attacked me physically. It had done worse. It had won, splitting my family in two and leaving me on the monster's side. The cry continued, an echo from below, a constant taunt. But now, woven into the cry and the humming, was a new layer in the static. A voice, whispering, deep and guttural, speaking in a tongue I did not know, but every syllable dripped with pure malice. Rage replaced fear, a cold, clear rage. This thing had used my exhaustion, my love for my son, my wife, to corner me, turned my home into its playground. I looked at the screen, the basement, the rotted cradle rocking in black water, the source. I could not stay, could not let this thing live under the same roof as my child. If Sarah thought I was the danger, I could not save her from the hallway. I had to destroy the source. I walked to the basement door. The cry on the device swelled as if it knew what I intended. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace we never used. A pathetic weapon, but it was all I had. With my other hand, I held the receiver. If I was going into its domain, I needed to see what it saw. I reached the basement door. The smell of wet earth and sweet rot was unbearable, leaking through the cracks. The cry and humming stopped on the device, replaced by static and that guttural whisper. The door was closed, but the lock was broken as we had left it. I opened it. A wall of damp cold hit my face. I turned on my phone's flashlight and held it with the receiver hand. The beam cut down the stone stairs into total darkness. I started down. My footsteps echoed in the sealed space. The water. It was there, a black mirror just a few steps from the bottom. The stench was suffocating. I stepped into the water. It was ice. The cold stabbed through my shoes and pants, a sharp pain shooting up my legs. It came nearly to my knees. Still, no ripples. The basement was larger than I had thought, stretching into shadow beneath the house. I swept the flashlight. The beam glinted off wet stone walls. I saw the rotted crates floating, rusted junk. Then I looked at the screen. The image flickered. Still the basement. But what the device showed was different from what my eyes saw. The water on the screen was not still. It churned, and it was full of shapes, pale forms moving just beneath the surface like large, sick fish. I looked up from the screen. The real water was perfectly calm. The entity was showing me the truth of the place, a parallel reality only the camera could capture. I raised the device and used it like a scanner, swept it into the dark around me. And I saw them. On the screen, dozens of Sarah apparitions stood in the water, all staring, all smiling that impossible grin. The basement was full of them, an army of my worst fears. But in the real world, under my flashlight, there was nothing. Then I saw the cradle, in the center of the flooded space, just as the screen had shown. I pushed through the freezing water toward it. The real water stayed still, but on the device, it boiled with pale shapes parting as I moved. I reached the cradle. It was dark wood, nearly black from water, swollen and coated in thick slime. And it rocked, slow, rhythmic, on its own. The baby cry returned, loud, coming from inside the cradle, but not from the device, from the real room, a piercing wail that drilled into my ears. Readying the poker, I aimed the flashlight into the cradle. It was empty. No baby. The cry came from the wood itself, from the structure. Then the cry stopped, and the demon's guttural voice spoke, this time from the cradle, making the water around me vibrate. I was waiting. For the father. The water at my feet exploded. The pale shapes I had only seen on the screen materialized. They rose from the black water. Sarah, apparitions, bodies bloated and pale, nightgowns plastered to their forms, eyes hollow. But their hands were black, bony claws. They grabbed me, seized my arms, my legs. I screamed, fighting them. The cold was unbearable, burning. They were impossibly strong. The poker fell from my hand, vanishing into the black water. They were pulling me under. The demon had tricked me. The cries, the device, the paranoia, all part of an elaborate ritual to lure me down here, isolate me, drown me in its lair. I looked at the screen still clutched in my hand. It showed the scene from above. Me, struggling against the Sarah things. Then the image shifted. Now it showed the door to Nico's bedroom. Sarah stood there, listening to my muffled screams rising through the floor. Terrified, but her face held something new. Doubt. The image changed again. The basement. And the entity revealed itself. It was not the cradle. was not the apparitions. It was the water. The black, stagnant water began to rise, to take shape. It became a column of dark liquid, a towering humanoid silhouette 10 feet tall, featureless, just a mass of cold, liquid shadow. That was the demon. The Sarah apparitions were only its hands. The column of dark water closed around me. I felt its pressure, its pure malice. I was lost. But then I saw something on the screen. In the basement camera feed, I saw my own flashlight fallen beside the cradle, and I saw the camera's power cord plugged into an old outlet in the stone wall, just above the waterline, an outlet that should not have been live. In one final act of desperation, I freed one arm. I lunged for the cord. The apparitions yanked me back, but it was close. I grabbed the camera power cord, the one feeding the device showing my death. And I pulled. I pulled with everything I had. The cord went taut. The outlet sparked against the wet wall. Then it gave. The live wire, stripped bare, fell straight into the black water we stood in. The world exploded in blinding white light. An inhuman guttural scream shook the house's foundation, a sound of pure agony. The basement water boiled instantly. A brutal electric surge ripped through my body, hurling me back against the stone wall. The Sarah apparitions convulsed, lit from within by the current and dissolved into steam and static. The dark water column collapsed in on itself. I blacked out. I woke on the upstairs hallway floor. Sarah was screaming my name, her hands slapping my chest. I was soaked, reeking of ozone and stagnant water. There was fire. The basement door stood open, thick black smoke pouring out. Sarah had somehow dragged me up. She grabbed me. "Javier, the house, we have to get Nico." We stumbled to our feet, ran to the baby's room. Smoke already filled the hallway. The wall-mounted camera dripped melted plastic. I scooped Nico from the crib. The baby cried, this time for real, terrified by the smoke. We ran from the house, collapsed onto the front lawn, coughing as flames began licking from the downstairs windows. The fire consumed the damp, the rot, the entity. We stayed there, the three of us wrapped together, watching the house burn. Sarah looked at me, face streaked with soot. There was no fear in her eyes, not toward me. I saw the baby monitor receiver on the grass where I had dropped it, escaping. The screen was cracked, dead. I picked it up and hurled it with all my strength at the driveway. It shattered. We had survived. The entity, whatever it was, had made a mistake. It had used the house itself, its wiring, its tech, to set its trap. And I had used that same trap to destroy it. As we watched the roof cave in, I knew we had lost our home, but the cry I heard now was my son's, real, alive in my arms. And that was the only sound that mattered. We had escaped the empty cry. Chronic insomnia isn't just not sleeping. It's a kind of erosion. It's seeing the world through a veil of exhaustion, a layer of unreality that turns everything grayish and distant. My name's Salvador, and I'd been like that for years, 3, maybe 4. I'd lost count. The nights were the worst. They stretched into dead time. Hours spent staring at the ceiling, listening to the fridge hum, feeling the gritty texture of my eyelids scraping over dry eyes. My mind, desperate for rest, refused to shut off, looping through useless thoughts, irrational fears, and shattered memories. Desperation had driven me to try everything. Pills that left me groggy but not rested, sleep hygiene therapy, meditation, white noise. Nothing worked. Reality was getting thin, brittle. It was an old coworker, Damian, who told me about the clinic. I ran into him on the street after years apart. He looked different. He'd always been a jittery guy, full of tics and restless energy. Now he was calm, deeply, unnaturally calm. His stillness was almost unnatural, like the surface of a frozen lake. I told him about my problem, my exhaustion. He nodded slowly, like he'd heard it before. He handed me a card, pure white, thick stock, with a name embossed in stark black letters, Albanese Sleep Clinic. He said it wasn't cheap, it was exclusive, but it was permanent. He said Dr. Albanese was a genius, a true architect of rest. I got an appointment. The clinic wasn't in a medical district. It was in a sleek office tower, top floor. Minimalist space, almost painfully sterile. No crowded waiting rooms, no dog-eared magazines. Just white walls, polished gray marble floors, and absolute silence, so deep I could hear my own blood pulsing in my ears. A receptionist in gray greeted me without a smile and led me down a long hallway to a heavy door. Dr. Albanese was tall, thin, ageless. He wore a flawless gray suit. His face was pale, his dark eyes still. He didn't blink enough. His calm was 100 times more intense than Damian's, an absolute stillness that seemed to swallow the room's sound. He spoke softly, almost a whisper, but every word was crystal clear. His voice resonated, vibrating in my chest. He asked questions, but not about my fears or stress. He asked about geometry, my childhood dreams, whether I preferred open or enclosed spaces. Weird questions that felt more like a personality test than a medical consult. I told him I just wanted to sleep. He smiled faintly. He said sleep wasn't a shutdown, it was construction. He said my problem wasn't that I couldn't sleep, but that I didn't know where to sleep. The treatment was cutting edge. He called it sonic resonance. He took me to another room, even quieter, empty except for a stone slab like a bed or gurney, carved from a single block of dark rock. The walls weren't plaster, but some sound-absorbing material that killed every echo. He had me lie down. The stone's cold seeped through my clothes. No electrodes, no needles, just small metal discs on my temples. He said not to be afraid. That I was about to experience the deepest sleep of my life. He left. The room went dark. Then the sound started. Not music. A hum. An impossibly low frequency I could barely hear but felt in my teeth, my bones. The sound grew in intensity, not volume. It filled the room, wrapped around me. The stone slab vibrated with it. My body got heavy, unbearably heavy, like liquid lead pouring into me. I didn't float. I sank. It was terrifying, falling through the stone, through the building's floor, into dense, compact darkness. And then, for the first time in years, I slept. It wasn't a normal dream. No people, no memories, no anxieties. It was a place, a silent place. I stood in an immense plaza paved with pale gray slabs, perfectly cut, no visible seams. The sky above was uniform gray. No sun, no clouds, but luminous. The architecture was the most striking part. Massive skyscrapers with impossible angles rose around me. Structures of dark glass and black metal, geometrically perfect but wrong. Lines weren't straight. They curved subtly, creating dizzying perspectives. No doors, no windows, just smooth, flawless surfaces. I walked across the plaza. My footsteps made no sound. The silence was absolute. No wind, no birds, no one. I was completely alone in this dead, perfect metropolis. I felt a strange peace, a cold calm. The absence of life was soothing. I sat on the edge of a dry fountain, an obsidian obelisk twisting toward the gray sky, and I just existed. No thoughts, no fears, just silence. I woke gently, a softness I didn't remember. I opened my eyes. I was back in the treatment room. The lights were on. The hum was gone. I felt incredibly rested, physically light, mentally sharp. The veil of fatigue had lifted. I left the room. Dr. Albanese was waiting in his office, that faint, fixed smile on his face. He asked how I felt. I said I felt new. He said the treatment was a success. My mind had responded well to the resonance. He scheduled me for the next night, saying it took multiple sessions to stabilize. I left the clinic and stepped into the elevator. I was euphoric. The world looked bright, crisp. I reached the lobby and walked out onto the street. It was 4 a.m. the city quiet. But the moment my foot hit the sidewalk, the euphoria froze. Something was wrong. I looked around. The street was the same, the buildings, the streetlights, but the colors were muted. The red of a stop sign wasn't vibrant. It was a dull brownish red. The yellow of parked taxis looked faded, sickly. The streetlights weren't white. They were a yellowish gray. It was as if someone had turned down the saturation on the entire world. And the sounds were off. A car passed in the distance, but its engine was muffled far away, like I was hearing it through a thick wall. The city's constant white noise had vanished. The silence was almost as deep as the clinics, as the gray city in my dream. I rubbed my eyes. It had to be a side effect, or maybe the result of sleeping so deeply. My senses were disoriented, readjusting to being awake. That had to be it. I walked home. With every step, the sense of unreality grew. The building lines looked wrong. I stopped to stare at the structure across the street. The corners, the right angles, didn't look quite right. There was a subtle curve in the cornice, an angle in the window that seemed off, slightly obtuse where it should have been square. I blinked. The image normalized for a second, then warped again. I reached my apartment, my heart pounding with a new kind of anxiety. The real world felt as strange as the dream one. The impossible geometry of the gray city seemed to be leaking into reality. I went inside, locked the door. My apartment's silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was identical to the gray plazas. And in the hallway mirror, for a split second, my reflection looked washed out, my skin a shade grayer than usual. I chalked it up to exhaustion, but as I got ready for the day, I couldn't shake a terrifying thought. I'd slept, yeah, but I wasn't sure I'd fully woken up. I made it through the rest of the night and the next day in a state of mounting anxiety. The waking world had become hostile. The unreality I'd lived with during my years of insomnia was a joke compared to this. That was fatigue. This was corruption. I went to work, moving like a robot. The office colors, once bright and annoying, were now a dead palette of grays, beiges, and pale blues. The sunlight through the window wasn't warm. It was flat, grayish, like the sky in my dream. The worst part was the sounds. Everything was muffled. My co-workers' voices reached me like they were on the other side of a thick wall, their words garbled murmurs, distant. I tried to hold a conversation, but it was impossible. I couldn't follow the thread. My keyboard clicks were dull, no echo. It was like being wrapped in cotton, isolated, alone with the hum of my own blood. And the geometry. The real world's angles still looked wrong. My desk corner didn't seem 90 degrees. The hallway to the elevator felt subtly longer than I remembered, the ceiling lower. I was dizzy, disoriented. I blamed it on residual treatment effects, some kind of sensory hangover. But the rest had been so deep, so perfect. The silence of the gray city, which at first felt empty, now seemed like a blessing, a peace I'd never known in my waking life. That day the fatigue came back with a vengeance. But it wasn't my usual kind, not the nervous agitation of insomnia. It was a heaviness, a deep sleepiness pulling me down. My body, having tasted real rest, now demanded it, and my mind, tormented by the distorted, silent, waking world, craved the peace of the gray metropolis. That night I went back to the clinic. I had no choice. The thought of facing another sleepless night in a world unraveling was unbearable. I needed the silence, the stillness. I needed the sleep only Dr. Albanese could give me. He greeted me with the same unnatural calm, his gray suit, his dark, still eyes. He asked about my day. I told him about the colors, the sounds, the wrong angles. He nodded slowly, unsurprised. He called it sensory recalibration. He explained that my brain, overstimulated for years by sleep deprivation, was now detoxing. The real world seemed muted because I was finally seeing it without the filter of adrenaline and panic. The dream world I'd visited was the baseline, the the 0 point of consciousness, and my mind would recalibrate. His voice was so calm, so resonant, it melted my fears. He was the doctor. He knew what he was doing. I lay back on the dark stone slab, felt the piercing cold, the metal discs on my temples, the darkness, and again the hum, the low, deep vibration in my bones. I sank again, falling through the stone into dense, compact darkness, and then I was there. The gray city, the same immense plaza, the same dark glass and black metal buildings, the same impossible geometry defying logic, the same luminous gray sky, and the silence. Absolute, perfect silence. I breathed deeply, peace flooding me. It was like coming home, but this time something was different. The first time the city was empty. This time there was someone. I saw him far off, across the plaza, a lone figure standing before one of the crystal monoliths, slowly tracing the building's surface with a finger. A pang of unease hit me. This was my place of silence. Another presence was an intrusion. I walked toward him, my footsteps still silent on the perfect slabs. As I got closer, I recognized his posture, his clothes. It was Damian, my old co-worker, the one who'd recommended the clinic. The man whose unnatural calm had impressed me so much. I called out, "Damian." My voice sounded strange, loud, shattering the perfect silence, but it didn't echo. The sound just died, absorbed by the gray air. He turned slowly. His face was the same as on the street. Calm, serene. But his eyes were completely blank. Not dark, not light. Polished gray, like the clinic's marble floor. No pupils. No life. He looked at me but didn't see me, and then he smiled. It wasn't his smile. It was Dr. Albanese's faint, fixed, unnatural smile. I stepped back. Terror erased all the peace I'd felt. Damian tilted his head, bird-like curiosity, and I heard a voice in my head. Not Damian's. Dr. Albanese's calm, resonant voice, vibrating inside my skull. "Welcome back, Salvador. I see you found one of our oldest residents." "What is this?" I asked, my own voice weak in my mind. "What did you do to him?" Damian, or the thing inside him, took a step toward me. "Damian helped us greatly," Dr. Albanese's voice said in my head. His mind was chaotic, full of energy, excellent building material, but it lacked structure, lacked the precision you have. I looked around at the impossible buildings. "Building? What are you talking about?" "This place," the voice said, "the world of lethargy. We build it together. My patients and I. They provide the raw material, the energy of their sleepless minds. I provide the design. I am the architect. And you, Salvador, with your love of geometry and order, are my finest builder yet. The dream you had last night, that spiral tower in the North District, was entirely your creation. Exquisite." I froze. My dream hadn't been a passive visit. I'd been working, building this gray prison without knowing it. And Damian wasn't a cured patient. He was a permanent resident, an empty shell, his mind drained to hold up these insane structures. I turned to run, but the plaza wasn't empty anymore. There were more figures, dozens, men and women in sleepwear or suits, all with the same polished gray eyes, all with Dr. Albanese's empty smile. They emerged from the building's smooth surfaces. The other patients, and they were closing in, forming a circle. "You can't leave, Salvador," Dr. Albanese's voice said, now coming from every figure at once. "The work isn't done. It's just begun. We're building a perfect world, a world of order, a world of silence. And you're the key piece." I tried to wake up. It was a dream. It had to be. I focused, tried to force my eyelids open in the real world, but I couldn't. The low-frequency hum, my entry point, was now my anchor. It held me there. Panic flooded me. I screamed, but no sound came out. Then I saw Dr. Albanese himself. Not one of the gray figures, but standing atop one of the twisted skyscrapers, looking down at me, in his gray suit, watching with the clinical interest of an architect reviewing blueprints. Suddenly, the falling sensation returned. The gray city dissolved. I fell into dense darkness, and I woke. I bolted upright on the stone slab, gasping, soaked in cold sweat. The treatment room lights were on. I was alone. The door opened. Dr. Albanese walked in. "A restless dream," he said with his usual calm. "It's normal. You're fighting your own healing. Your mind still resists order." I climbed off the slab, shaking. He watched me with those dark, patient eyes. I said nothing. I ran out of the room, down the marble hallway, past the gray receptionist, out of the building. The street. It was worse. Much worse. The colors weren't just muted, they were nearly gone. The world was a black and white sketch with faint, sick hints of color. And the geometry. It wasn't subtle anymore. Buildings visibly bent. Sidewalks rippled under my feet. Streetlights leaned at impossible angles. The real world was becoming the gray city. The nightmare was bleeding into waking life. I got to my apartment, locked the door, leaned against it. I had to stay awake. I couldn't go back to the clinic. If I slept there again, I'd be trapped forever, like Damian. I spent the night pacing my apartment, drinking coffee, splashing cold water on my face. Insomnia was back. But it was a new, terrifying kind. Because every time I closed my eyes, even for a second, I saw it. The gray city, waiting for me. And then I realized the true horror. My apartment was silent, but beneath the silence I heard something. A hum, faint but unmistakable. The same low, deep note from the clinic. It wasn't from headphones, not from any machine. It was coming from inside my own head. Dr. Albanese had tuned me to his frequency. I didn't need to go back to the clinic to sleep. The architect had installed his machinery inside me. I closed my eyes, exhausted, and the gray city rushed in. I was trapped. If I slept, he got me. If I stayed awake, the real world crumbled, becoming his creation. There was no escape. The lethargy was everywhere. I fought sleep with a desperation I'd never known. My old enemy, insomnia, was now my only ally. But the hum in my head, Dr. Albanese's frequency, was a constant engine dragging me toward lethargy. I spent the first night in feverish terror, pacing my apartment nonstop. I splashed ice water on my face, pinched myself until my arms were bruised, drank so much coffee my heart pounded erratically against my ribs. But exhaustion was an ocean, and I was a castaway. Every time my eyelids closed, even for a second, the gray city lunged at me, twisted skyscrapers filling my vision, and Dr. Albanese's voice whispering in my mind. "Rest, Salvador. Stop fighting. Order is peace." The real world, my supposed refuge, was becoming the true nightmare. With every hour I stayed awake, the corruption worsened. My living room walls lost their color, turning sickly pale gray. The yellow glow of my lamp went dull, lifeless, and the angles. They started twisting. I looked at my bedroom doorframe and saw the top corner was no longer a perfect right angle. It was subtly slanted, an impossible geometry that made me nauseous. The hum in my head grew, syncing with my fatigue's vibration. The waking world wasn't safe. It was just the antechamber. The gray city was bleeding through reality, and Dr. Albanese was painting my world with the colors of his lethargy. The second night was worse. I could barely stand. I dragged myself around the apartment, slamming walls to stay conscious. My home's silence was now identical to the gray plaza's. And then I saw him. In the hallway by the bathroom door stood Damian, wearing the same suit from the Dream City. He was there in my real world, or what was left of it. His eyes were polished gray marbles, and he was smiling. With Dr. Albanese's fixed, serene, inhuman smile, I screamed and threw a mug at him. It passed through him like smoke, shattering against the far wall. But the wall didn't sound like drywall. It sounded like dark glass. Damian, or his echo, didn't move. He just tilted his head, curious. And Dr. Albaniz's voice came from his mouth, real, resonant, vibrating in my apartment's dead air. You can't fight the inevitable, Salvador. The real world is noisy, chaotic, imperfect. It's a disease. We're building the cure. And you're already cured. Damian's figure dissolved, but the terror gave me sudden clarity. Dr. Albaniz was right about one thing. I couldn't fight him here. The real world was becoming his territory. My mind, my insomnia, my fatigue, everything was tuned to his frequency. Staying awake only weakened me, letting the infection spread. The hum in my head was the key, the door. And if he could use it to enter my world, maybe I could use it to enter his. But this time, not as a passive sleeper. I made a desperate choice. I stopped fighting sleep. I stopped pacing. I went to my bedroom, avoiding the wall's wrong angles. I lay down on my bed. The hum in my head was now a low roar, a welcome. I closed my eyes, not seeking rest, but seeking my enemy. I focused on the frequency, let myself sink. I didn't fall, I dove. I landed on my feet. The gray city was around me instantly. The leaden sky, the plaza of perfect slabs, the silence. But this time was different. I was conscious, lucid. I knew it was a dream or a mental world, and I was there with my will intact. Dr. Albaniz stood in the plaza's center by the obsidian obelisk. He was waiting. A wise decision, Salvador. His voice resonated in my head, though his lips didn't move. Acceptance is the first step toward perfect order. Around him, the gray figures began materializing from the glass walls. Damian, the other patients, dozens, their polished, empty eyes. They started walking toward me, slow, relentless, closing the circle. I raised a hand. Wait. I looked at Dr. Albaniz, watching from a distance with his architect's calm. You said my mind resisted order. You were right. Resistance is just a symptom of chaos. His voice said, it will be purged. You'll join us. Become a beautiful, silent part of the structure. The gray figures were meters away. Panic flooded me, but I seized it. Chaos, disease, imperfection. That's what the real world was made of, and that's what my insomnia was. Dr. Albaniz used their minds to build this ordered place. But what if I used mine for the opposite? I looked past him, to the horizon of impossible buildings. I spotted the spiral tower, the one he'd called my exquisite creation. The tallest, most complex structure. A work of geometric genius, but also madness, and it was mine. I ignored the advancing gray figures. I focused on the tower. I gathered all the rage, panic, years of sleepless nights, all the frustration and pain of my broken life. I took that raw, imperfect, noisy chaos inside me, and I hurled it at the tower. Dr. Albaniz tilted his head. What are you doing? The tower trembled. A small black crack appeared at its dark glass base. Stop. The gray figures lunged. Their cold hands grabbed me, but I wasn't there. I was in the tower. I focused on the crack. I thought of screeching bus brakes, a blaring car alarm, a loud rock song, the pain of my own migraines. I thought of everything that didn't belong in that silent world. The crack widened. The dark glass began to splinter. The low-frequency hum holding this world together faltered. It turned dissonant, painful. The gray figures holding me froze, confused. Their empty faces showed for the first time something like anguish. They let go and stepped back. You've broken the pattern, Dr. Albaniz's voice screamed in my head. For the first time, it wasn't calm. It was panicked. The order. You're corrupting the order. I looked at him. His pale, serene face was twisted with rage. You were perfect. You were the pillar. I smiled, and I hit the tower with my mind again. The spiral tower shattered. It collapsed in a silent cascade of millions of dark glass fragments, and with it, the world began to unravel. The gray sky flickered, revealing glimpses of empty darkness behind. The perfect slab floor cracked, opening to an abyss. The other figures, the patients, dissolved like smoke, their minds freed from the architect's control. Damian was the last to go. He paused in front of me. His polished gray eyes seemed to regain a flicker of light for a moment. Then he dissolved. Dr. Albanese stared at me from across the collapsing plaza. He was alone, surrounded by the ruin of his perfect world. His face was a mask of pure hatred. "You'll be back," he shouted, his voice now weak, human. Chaos always returns. Then I felt the falling sensation, but this time upward. A violent force was ejecting me. The gray city vanished. I woke with a jolt, tumbling off my own bed. I hit the hardwood floor hard. I gasped, breathing dust. I lay there shaking, my body aching, my heart racing. Silence. I sat up slowly. I looked around. The doorframe. It was straight. Perfect 90-degree angles. Sunlight streamed through the window. It was warm, golden. The colors were back. The yellow of my quilt, the blue of a book. Vibrant, almost painfully intense. The hum in my head was gone. The remaining silence was the normal quiet of a Sunday morning, with distant traffic and a bird singing outside. I was exhausted, more tired than I'd ever been. A deep, clean exhaustion that reached my bones. I crawled back into bed. I wasn't afraid. The architect was gone. His connection was broken. I'd used my own mind, my own chaos, to destroy his world of perfect order. Insomnia, my old torment, had been my weapon. I realized that chaos, noise, and the real world's imperfection weren't the disease, as Dr. Albanese claimed. They were proof we were alive. The perfect order he sought was just death by another name. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in years, without machines, without hums, without gray cities, I sank into a natural, deep, completely silent sleep. I'd reclaimed my mind. My life was a study in contrasts, an endless quest for absolute black and pure white. I specialized in artistic black and white portraits, and my name, Simon, had earned a quiet respect in some pretty exclusive circles. But my real sanctuary was my darkroom, a deep basement under an old building where the only sounds were my own thoughts and the rhythmic drip of water in the trays. I spent most of my time in that sealed-off space, cut off from the world's light, bathed only in the dense red glow of the safe light. It was a chemical womb, a place where I controlled reality. The smell was sharp, a mix of acetic acid, fixer, and the metallic tang of wet paper. I knew every shadow in that room. The shadows of the chemical bottles lined up on the shelf, the enlarger's shadow on the workbench, the long shadows of the tongs hanging over the trays. They were my companions, constant, predictable, safe. The outside world was a mess of uncontrollable light and color, but here, under the red light, I was the sole creator. I decided what emerged from nothing and what stayed in the dark. The job that changed everything came on a gray Tuesday afternoon. A new client, a guy I knew nothing about except that he'd paid up front in cash, a hefty sum, for a portrait session. He showed up right on time. Tall, pale, dressed in a dark, old-fashioned suit. He didn't talk much. His answers were one-word grunts. What creeped me out most were his eyes, incredibly dark, almost black, and they didn't reflect my studio lights like they should. The session was weird. He didn't pose, he just existed in front of the camera. His stillness was unnatural. I moved around him, tweaking the lights, trying to build those deep contrasts I loved. I used harsh side lighting to throw dramatic shadows. He never blinked during the flash bursts. When it was over, he paid the rest, grabbed his coat in silence, and left, leaving me alone with the exposed film rolls and this vague, nagging unease. That night, I headed down to the darkroom to start processing. I developed the negatives. They came out perfect, technically flawless. The contrasts were stunning. The guy's pale skin popped against the dark background I'd chosen. I picked the best frames, set up my enlarger, slid in the first negative, dialed in the focus, the exposure time. The enlarger's light projected the ghostly image of the man onto the virgin photo paper. I exposed it. The light clicked off. I grabbed the blank, smooth sheet, slid it into the developer tray, rocked it gently with the tongs under the red light, and watched the magic happen, like hundreds of times before. The latent image started emerging from the white nothing, deep blacks first, then the grays, the dark jacket, the background, and then the pale face, and the shadow. I froze. The tray's rocking stopped dead. Something was wrong. The shadow the guy cast on the backdrop. The key light was coming hard from the left, throwing a sharp shadow to his right. But the shadow on the paper wasn't right. It was way too long, stretched way beyond what the lighting setup allowed. And the shape. His head shadow was fine, but the shoulder and arm were warped, like the arm casting it was bent in some impossible way. And the hand. The hand shadow looked like it had 6 fingers. I frowned, leaned closer to the tray, the red light turning the chemical liquid blood-colored. Blinked. No way. I checked the negative in the enlarger. The image there was normal. Looked back at the paper in the developer. The shadow was still there, monstrous, 6-fingered. I chalked it up to a glitch. Light leak, maybe. Accidental double exposure, though that was damn near impossible with my gear. Or contaminated developer staining the paper weirdly. I moved the print to the stop bath, then the fixer. My movements on autopilot now, my brain buzzing. The image set, permanent. The shadow stayed, mocking me. I decided to try another negative from the same session. Cleaned everything, checked my chemicals, repeated the process, exposed the paper, dunked it in the developer, watched. The image emerged. The guy in a slightly different pose, almost looking at the camera. Lighting more frontal this time. Fewer shadows. But the little shadow his body cast on the floor under his feet. I swear it moved. No, it couldn't. I went rigid. It was a chemical image fixing on paper. But I'd seen it. For a split second, as the gray settled, the shadow twisted like a drop of black ink in water. I backed away from the tray, heart pounding. This was fatigue, chemical fumes. My mind, worn out from the weird session, playing tricks. I finished processing the second print and hung it on the line next to the first. The 2 images, wet and glossy under the red light, dripped fixer into the catch tray. In both, the shadows were unnatural. One had the wrong shape. The other had contrast so deep the black seemed to swallow the red light. I called it a night, killed the safe light, flipped on the regular white studio light, and left, locking the darkroom door behind me. The basement silence felt heavy. I climbed the stairs to my small ground-floor apartment, leaving the prints to dry in the dark. The next day I avoided the studio, tried to convince myself it was just tiredness. But the unease lingered. By afternoon, I couldn't take it. I had to see the prints in daylight. Went down to the basement. The studio was quiet. Opened the darkroom door. The chemical smell was fainter. Hit the white light. Went to the drying line where the prints hung, now bone dry. The first one, the profile with the 6-finger shadow, was there. I grabbed it, looked under the bright light. The shadow was still long, distorted, but the hand didn't have 6 fingers anymore, now just 5. Except the index finger shadow was freakishly long, almost claw-like. It had changed. I checked the second print, the one where I thought the shadow moved. It was still now, fixed, but darker. The black under his feet was absolute, a patch of void on the photo paper that sucked in the room's light. A black that shouldn't exist in silver emulsion. I knew I wasn't crazy. The prints weren't static. The thing, whatever it was trapped in the emulsion, and it was alive. The mystery client, the guy with the dark eyes. He hadn't come for a portrait. He'd come to leave something behind. He'd planted a seed in my studio, and then my sanctuary, my darkroom, became my prison. I went back that night armed with fresh resolve. I had to understand it. I'd run the process again. Turned on the safe light. The darkroom greeted me with its familiar glow. But the silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was waiting. Set up the trays, picked a third negative, loaded the paper, exposed the print, dunked it in the developer, watched with feverish intensity. The image emerged, the guy's pale face, and the shadow. This time the shadow behind him was huge, a shapeless mass wrapping around him. And as I stared, the shadow in the liquid spread, spilled beyond the guy's edges, creeping slowly to the paper's border, like living ink. I yelled and yanked the print out with the tongs. The shadow froze mid-crawl. But the real terror wasn't in the tray. It was beside me. I hung the print, turned, and spotted something on the wall. The enlarger's shadow. It had always been there, a clean silhouette from the safe light. But now it was wrong. Bent. The enlarger's neck was straight, but its wall shadow curved unnaturally, like it was twisted. I stood frozen. The red was the only light source. The shadow should be a direct projection, but it wasn't. Slowly I raised my hand, tongs still in it between the light and the wall, saw my shadow, and watched in horror as my finger shadows on the wall stretched, elongated on their own like dark tentacles reaching almost to the ceiling, while my real hand stayed still at my side. The tong shadows writhed like snakes. The thing had escaped the prints, or maybe it was never just in them. It had infected my sanctuary, infected the only light I worked under. Red wasn't safe anymore. It was the color of its world. And then I saw my own shadow. Standing by the wall, my silhouette cast by the red light. The shadow was still mimicking me. But as I watched, my shadow turned its head. Slowly, its dark head swiveled on its shoulders, independent of me, and looked at me. No eyes, but I felt the stare. Cold, malevolent, hungry. I stood completely still, the chemical air frozen in my lungs. I was staring at my own shadow, and my shadow was staring back. Panic was an ice needle in my neck. Impossible. My shadow, that simple absence of light from my body, was showing will. I stayed frozen, tongs in hand. Raised my right hand slowly to test. My shadow mirrored it, perfect reflection. But when I moved my hand left, the shadow's hand moved left too. Not mirrored, but direct copy, breaking reflection physics. A choked scream died in my throat. The shadow lowered its arm, though mine was still up. The link was broken. The thing, the being that came in the client's film, wasn't just in the prints anymore. It was here in my sanctuary, and it had taken over my darkness. I dropped the tongs. The metal clatter on the tray shattered the silence. And the shadow reacted. It shrank, not like a normal shadow, but like a scared animal. Then it lunged, didn't peel off the wall. It couldn't, but it stretched, distorting, its dark head racing across the wall toward me, its arms of darkness extending like tentacles. I stumbled back, crashing into the workbench. Chemical bottles wobbled. Acetic acid smell flooded the air. The shadow recoiled, snapping back to my silhouette, but now it felt different. Heavy, like something clinging to my back, an invisible parasite controlling my projection. My life was a study in contrasts, an endless quest for absolute black and pure white. I specialized in artistic black and white portraits, and my name, Simon, had earned a quiet respect in some pretty exclusive circles. But my real sanctuary was my darkroom, a deep basement under an old building where the only sounds were my own thoughts and the rhythmic drip of water in the trays. I spent most of my time in that sealed-off space, cut off from the world's light, bathed only in the dense red glow of the safe light. It was a chemical womb, a place where I controlled reality. The smell was sharp, a mix of acetic acid, fixer, and the metallic tang of wet paper. I knew every shadow in that room. The shadows of the chemical bottles lined up on the shelf, the enlarger's shadow on the workbench, the long shadows of the tongs hanging over the trays. They were my companions, constant, predictable, safe. The outside world was a mess of uncontrollable light and color, but here, under the red light, I was the sole creator. I decided what emerged from nothing and what stayed in the dark. The job that changed everything came on a gray Tuesday afternoon. A new client, a guy I knew nothing about except that he'd paid up front in cash, a hefty sum, for a portrait session. He showed up right on time. Tall, pale, dressed in a dark, old-fashioned suit. He didn't talk much, his answers were one-word grunts. What creeped me out most were his eyes, incredibly dark, almost black, and they didn't reflect my studio lights like they should. The session was weird. He didn't pose, he just existed in front of the camera. His stillness was unnatural. I moved around him, tweaking the lights, trying to build those deep contrasts I loved. I used harsh side lighting to throw dramatic shadows. He never blinked during the flash bursts. When it was over, he paid the rest, grabbed his coat in silence, and left, leaving me alone with the exposed film rolls and this vague, nagging unease. That night, I headed down to the darkroom to start processing. I developed the negatives. They came out perfect, technically flawless. The contrasts were stunning. The guy's pale skin popped against the dark background I'd chosen. I picked the best frames, set up my enlarger, slid in the first negative, dialed in the focus, the exposure time. The enlarger's light projected the ghostly image of the man onto the virgin photo paper. I exposed it. The light clicked off. I grabbed the blank, smooth sheet, slid it into the developer tray, rocked it gently with the tongs under the red light, and watched the magic happen, like hundreds of times before. The latent image started emerging from the white nothing, deep blacks first, then the grays, the dark jacket, the background, and then the pale face, and the shadow. I froze. The tray's rocking stopped dead. Something was wrong. The shadow the guy cast on the backdrop. The key light was coming hard from the left, throwing a sharp shadow to his right. But the shadow on the paper wasn't right. It was way too long, stretched way beyond what the lighting setup allowed. And the shape. His head shadow was fine, but the shoulder and arm were warped, like the arm casting it was bent in some impossible way. And the hand. The hand shadow looked like it had 6 fingers. I frowned, leaned closer to the tray, the red light turning the chemical liquid blood-colored. Blinked. No way. I checked the negative in the enlarger. The image there was normal. Looked back at the paper in the developer. The shadow was still there, monstrous, 6-fingered. I chalked it up to a glitch. Light leak, maybe. Accidental double exposure, though that was damn near impossible with my gear. Or contaminated developer staining the paper weirdly. I moved the print to the stop bath, then the fixer. My movements on autopilot now, my brain buzzing. The image set, permanent. The shadow stayed, mocking me. I decided to try another negative from the same session. Cleaned everything, checked my chemicals, repeated the process, exposed the paper, dunked it in the developer, watched. The image emerged. The guy in a slightly different pose, almost looking at the camera. Lighting more frontal this time. Fewer shadows. But the little shadow his body cast on the floor under his feet. I swear it moved. No, it couldn't. I went rigid. It was a chemical image fixing on paper. But I'd seen it. For a split second, as the gray settled, the shadow twisted like a drop of black ink in water. I backed away from the tray, heart pounding. This was fatigue, chemical fumes. My mind, worn out from the weird session, playing tricks. I finished processing the second print and hung it on the line next to the first. The 2 images, wet and glossy under the red light, dripped fixer into the catch tray. In both, the shadows were unnatural. One had the wrong shape. The other had contrast so deep the black seemed to swallow the red light. I called it a night, killed the safe light, flipped on the regular white studio light, and left, locking the darkroom door behind me. The basement silence felt heavy. I climbed the stairs to my small ground-floor apartment, leaving the prints to dry in the dark. The next day I avoided the studio, tried to convince myself it was just tiredness. But the unease lingered. By afternoon, I couldn't take it. I had to see the prints in daylight. Went down to the basement. The studio was quiet. Opened the darkroom door. The chemical smell was fainter. hit the white light, went to the drying line where the prints hung, now bone dry. The first one, the profile with the 6-finger shadow, was there. I grabbed it, looked under the bright light. The shadow was still long, distorted, but the hand didn't have 6 fingers anymore, now just 5. Except the index finger shadow was freakishly long, almost claw-like. It had changed. I checked the second print, the one where I thought the shadow moved. It was still now, fixed, but darker. The black under his feet was absolute, a patch of void on the photo paper that sucked in the room's light. A black that shouldn't exist in silver emulsion. I knew I wasn't crazy. The prints weren't static. The thing, whatever it was trapped in the emulsion, and it was alive. The mystery client, the guy with the dark eyes. He hadn't come for a portrait. He'd come to leave something behind. He'd planted a seed in my studio, and then my sanctuary, my dark room, became my prison. I went back that night armed with fresh resolve. I had to understand it. I'd run the process again. Turned on the safe light. The dark room greeted me with its familiar glow. But the silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was waiting. Set up the trays, picked a third negative, loaded the paper, exposed the print, dunked it in the developer, watched with feverish intensity. The image emerged, the guy's pale face, and the shadow. This time the shadow behind him was huge, a shapeless mass wrapping around him. And as I stared, the shadow in the liquid spread, spilled beyond the guy's edges, creeping slowly to the paper's border, like living ink. I yelled and yanked the print out with the tongs. The shadow froze mid-crawl. But the real terror wasn't in the tray. It was beside me. I hung the print, turned, and spotted something on the wall. The enlarger's shadow. It had always been there, a clean silhouette from the safe light. But now it was wrong. Bent. The enlarger's neck was straight, but its wall shadow curved unnaturally, like it was twisted. I stood frozen. The red was the only light source. The shadow should be a direct projection, but it wasn't. Slowly I raised my hand, tongs still in it between the light and the wall, saw my shadow, and watched in horror as my finger shadows on the wall stretched, elongated on their own like dark tentacles reaching almost to the ceiling, while my real hand stayed still at my side. The tong shadows writhed like snakes. The thing had escaped the prints, or maybe it was never just in them. It had infected my sanctuary, infected the only light I worked under. Red wasn't safe anymore. It was the color of its world. And then I saw my own shadow. Standing by the wall, my silhouette cast by the red light. The shadow was still mimicking me. But as I watched, my shadow turned its head. Slowly, its dark head swiveled on its shoulders, independent of me, and looked at me. No eyes, but I felt the stare. Cold, malevolent, hungry. I stood completely still, the chemical air frozen in my lungs. I was staring at my own shadow, and my shadow was staring back. Panic was an ice needle in my neck. Impossible. My shadow, that simple absence of light from my body, was showing will. I stayed frozen, tongs in hand. Raised my right hand slowly to test. My shadow mirrored it, perfect reflection. But when I moved my hand left, the shadow's hand moved left too. Not mirrored, but direct copy, breaking reflection physics. A choked scream died in my throat. The shadow lowered its arm, though mine was still up. The link was broken. The thing, the being that came in the client's film, wasn't just in the prints anymore. It was here in my sanctuary, and it had taken over my darkness. I dropped the tongs. The metal clatter on the tray shattered the silence, and the shadow reacted. It shrank, not like a normal shadow, but like a scared animal. Then it lunged, didn't peel off the wall. It couldn't, but it stretched, distorting, its dark head racing across the wall toward me, its arms of darkness extending like tentacles. I stumbled back, crashing into the workbench. Chemical bottles wobbled. Acetic acid smell flooded the air. The shadow recoiled, snapping back to my silhouette, but now it felt different. Heavy, like something clinging to my back. An invisible parasite controlling my projection. My left arm, free, moved. With desperate speed, snatched the amber plastic bleach bottle. My right arm, shadow-controlled, tried stopping it, swatting my other arm. Bottle nearly slipped. I fought myself. Ridiculous, terrifying battle under red light. Right arm stronger, but left had desperation. Got the bottle open. Sharp chemical smell filled the air. My wall shadow writhed, twisted, like the smell alone hurt. The thing hated this. Poured the yellowish liquid over the tray, over the negatives. The instant bleach hit celluloid, my wall shadow screamed. Not sound, vibration. Pulse of cold hate so intense I dropped to my knees. Darkroom shook. Shelf bottles rattled, and my shadow peeled off the wall. The darkness tore from the plaster like ripping fabric. Stopped being 2D projection, became more. 3D mass of dark man-shaped hole in the air. The client's silhouette. Black-eyed guy. Pure blackness, but solid. Turned to me. Raised a shadow arm. Room cold so bad the tray bleach started crystallizing. The thing lunged, not to hit, but grab the negatives. Stop me. Terrified, but I'd anticipated. Left hand, uncontrolled one, shot to the main switch. White light. As the shadow neared touch, my hand slammed the switch. White fluorescent, bright, merciless, flooded with electric buzz. Thing caught mid-lunge. Pure light hit its dark body, devastating. 3D shadow screamed, audible now. Horrible, like 1,000 negatives burning. Black form contracted, boiled like water on hot plate. Dissolved, evaporated like black smoke under noon sun. Gone in under 3 seconds. I stayed on the floor, gasping, blinded by white. Looked at the tray. Bleach did its job. Negative images vanished. Celluloid transparent, clean, empty. Link broken. Wall. My shadow there. Cast by white light, pale gray silhouette, normal, obedient. Moved when I did. Alone again. Killed the light, gathered my stuff, left the darkroom. Basement studio silent, but normal silence. Cold gone. Ozone smell gone. Grabbed ruined prints from the line, transparent negatives from the tray. Bagged them. Climbed the basement stairs for the last time. Locked the door. Out of the building to the street. Morning sun starting to rise. Pale gray city sky. Air fresh, real. Stopped by a sewer grate, tossed the bag in. Heard distant splash in dirty water. Stood there a moment, feeling the sun's warmth touch my face. I'd spent my life obsessed with shadows, finding beauty in contrast, absolute black. Chosen darkness as sanctuary, control. But learned the hard way, darkness isn't empty. Not just light's absence, it's presence. Hungry. Always waiting for someone to open the door, give it shape. I'd saved my life, but lost my art. Couldn't enter a dark room again. Couldn't see a shadow without remembering its cold, hungry stare. Chose daylight, chaotic, overexposed world. Imperfect, but real. And for the first time, I felt fully awake. The underwater silence was unnatural. It wasn't the living silence of the ocean, filled with distant clicks and microscopic life, but an acoustic void that sonar barely grazed. The mountain lake was a tomb of ice-cold water, and I was descending into its heart. My name is Martine. My job is to go where no one else can. Saturation diver. Deep-sea salvage operations. But this wasn't the sea. It was an artificial reservoir, created in the 1950s by flooding an entire valley, a town included. My mission was to descend over 300 feet, locate the old bank building in the drowned town, and retrieve a safe with historical documents. A strange job, funded by a private client with too much money and an obsession with the past. My diving bell, a sphere of bright yellow metal, descended slowly, suspended from the barge floating on the gray surface. The water was dark, a blackish green, and visibility was almost nil. At 150 feet, the sunlight disappeared completely. I switched on the bell's powerful exterior floodlights. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a constant swirl of particles, underwater snow that made the descent feel like a journey through dead outer space. My voice, high and metallic from the helium, filled the intercom as I checked the gas mix and pressure, and the reply from the surface confirmed everything was stable. At 400 feet, we hit bottom. Or rather, we landed softly in what used to be the town's main square. The feeling of impact was almost imperceptible. We pressurized the bell. I opened the bottom hatch and stepped out into the water. The cold was the first thing that hit me. It was a cold my hot water suit could barely keep at bay. A bone-deep cold. A mountain cold. I switched on my powerful helmet light. Visibility was terrible, no more than 10 or 15 feet. I was standing on cobblestones covered in a thick layer of silt and dead algae. Around me, like the ghosts of buildings, the silhouettes of houses emerged. The town was eerily intact. The flooding had been slow, preserving everything. The 2-story stone houses were still standing. The windows were empty black holes. The wooden doors, swollen and torn from their hinges, floated gently with my movement. It was a perfect cemetery. The silence was total, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical sound of my own breathing through the regulator. A sound unnaturally loud in this drowned world. I began to move, my heavy-weighted boots gripping the cobblestones, dragging the umbilical hose that connected me to the bell. I advanced down the main street. It was a surreal nightmare landscape. A wrought iron bench was still there, covered in algae, as if waiting for someone. Further on, the remains of a car, a 1940s model, rusted and reduced to its metal skeleton. As I walked, I had the first sensation. A wave of cold that had nothing to do with the water. A shiver that seemed to start inside my suit, in my spine. I stopped. I swept my flashlight beam around me. Just the dark shapes of the houses and the particle snow dancing in the light. The intercom crackled and the surface confirmed all was stable, so I kept moving. And then I saw them. Or rather, I thought I saw them. It was in the second house on the right. The door was open, hanging. I aimed my light into the dark interior. And for a split second, in the darkness beyond the threshold, I saw a face. A pale, bloated face with wide-open eyes staring at me. I stopped abruptly. My heart hammered. The face vanished. I aimed the flashlight deeper into the house. I only saw an empty room filled with silt, the remains of an overturned chair on the floor. There was nothing. It had to be an illusion. A piece of floating wood, a patch of algae that my brain, oxygen-deprived and under pressure, had interpreted as a face. But the feeling of being watched intensified. It was no longer a vague unease, it was a certainty. It was coming from all the houses, from all the empty black windows that surrounded me. I felt dozens of eyes fixed on me, the only point of light and sound in their silent world. I kept moving, trying to control my breathing. My job was dangerous, but this was different. This wasn't a physical risk. It was a mental assault. I reached the bank building. It was larger than the houses, with stone columns and a heavy metal door. It was closed, but the lock was rusted. I used a crowbar I had hooked to my harness. The door gave way with a dull groan that transmitted through the water, a horrible sound of tortured metal. The inside was dark as a tomb. I entered. The silt was deeper in here, almost to my knees, making every step a struggle. It was a large lobby. By the light of my helmet, I saw the marble counter, still standing. Behind it, the vault door. And then I saw the woman. She was standing in the corner, behind the counter. She was not an illusion. She was there. She wore a long, dark, old-fashioned dress. Her hair was loose, floating slowly around her like a dark halo. She was pale, her skin grayish. And she was watching me. Her eyes were open, milky, lifeless, but fixed on me. I froze. I couldn't breathe. The apparition didn't move. She just observed me, motionless in the dead water. And then she raised a hand. Slowly. Her pale fingers extended toward me, as if welcoming me. I screamed inside my helmet. I stumbled back, tripping in the silt. I backed out of the bank, half swimming, my eyes locked on the darkness. The woman didn't follow. She just stayed there, in the gloom. I got back to the diving bell. My heart was pounding so hard the supervisor asked over the intercom what was wrong. I lied. I said I'd stumbled, that everything was fine. I couldn't admit I'd seen a ghost. They'd think I was crazy, pull me from the mission. I climbed into the bell, sealed the bottom hatch, and began to purge the water. I needed a break. I needed to stabilize. I sat on the small metal bench inside the bell, the pressurized air filling the space. I was shaking. I looked through the thick glass porthole. The black water stared back. I switched on the bell's exterior floodlights, illuminating the dead square. It was empty, but the town no longer just looked intact, it looked expectant. I spent the next hour in the bell trying to calm down, while on the surface they decided on the next steps. The supervisor told me to rest. I tried to close my eyes, and then I heard them. It wasn't a sound from the intercom, it was a whisper inside the bell. A faint whisper like running water, but it formed words. Cold. It's so cold. I snapped my eyes open. I was alone. The sound was coming from the metal of the sphere itself, vibrating. And then another voice. He can't leave. He's ours. I pressed myself against the opposite wall. The panic was returning. The intercom crackled and the surface reported there was nothing on their sensors. I realized the whispers were just for me. They were the ghosts of the drowned villagers, and they were with me in the bell, or in my head. And then I looked out the porthole. The beam of the floodlights lit up the square. And there, at the edge of the light, barely visible, they were. Pale figures. The man I had seen in the house, the woman from the bank, and others. Dozens of them. They had come out of the houses. They were standing in the silt watching me, watching the bell. They didn't move. They just observed. And as I watched, terrified, one of them, a small child in old-fashioned clothes, raised a hand and pressed it against the glass of the porthole. There was no sound, just the silent contact. And a crack. A fine spiderweb crack appeared in the impossibly thick glass where the phantom hand had touched it. I screamed. There was a second of panic on the surface, then the voice came back, tense. There was no crack. The sensors showed hull integrity was at 100%. I stared at the porthole. The crack was still there, small but undeniable. I touched it with my glove. I felt nothing. And the phantom child's face was still on the other side, looking at me, smiling. The apparition wasn't attacking me physically. It was driving me insane. It was making me doubt reality, doubt the safety of my own equipment. They were playing with me. They began the ascent for review. I felt the tug as the bell started to rise. The figures below, the silent community of the drowned, didn't try to stop me. They just raised their heads in unison, their milky eyes following me as I ascended, as if they knew I'd be back, as if they knew the lake had already marked me. The ascent was an eternity of silent terror. I stayed glued to the small metal bench, unable to look away from the porthole. The fine spiderweb crack was still there, an impossible flaw in the thick engineered glass. The pale face of the ghost child had vanished, but the other figures, the drowned community, remained in the square, motionless in the silt, watching me rise. Their milky eyes stayed fixed on the bell as the floodlights lifted, until the total darkness swallowed them again. The supervisor was talking in my ear over the intercom, his voice tinny from the helium. He was asking for readings, status reports, but I could barely answer. My breathing was erratic. The 20-minute journey to the surface felt like a year, every second spent waiting for the pressure of the icy water to shatter the damaged glass. When the bell breached the surface of the lake and coupled with the metallic clang to the support system on the barge, I almost cried out in relief. I heard the locking mechanisms, the hiss of air as the transfer chamber pressurized to mate with us. They ordered me into the decompression chamber. The journey wasn't over. Now the other form of confinement began. I crawled through the narrow tunnel into the decomp chamber, a white steel cylinder where I would spend the next few days. As soon as I was inside and the inner hatch was sealed, separating me from the diving bell, the deck crew swarmed the outer porthole. I heard their metallic voices through the hull, shouting orders. They were inspecting the crack. I sat on the narrow bunk, my body shaking from a residual cold that refused to leave. The chamber's interior was claustrophobic, smelling of clean metal, ozone from the air scrubbers, and the faint copper tang of the heliox mix. The pressure in here was immense, keeping me acclimated to the depth in case I had to go back down. 10 minutes passed. The small communication lock opened and a tray with hot food and water was passed through. Then the supervisor's face appeared in the small glass viewport connecting us. He took off his headset, his voice now muffled but audible through the glass. He indicated I was fine. He asked about the porthole, the crack. There was nothing. They had checked every inch. It was pristine. The hull's stress sensors were all green. There was no crack, there was nothing. I felt my blood freeze. No, I saw it, it was there, the kid touched it and the glass cracked. The supervisor looked at me with a mixture of pity and professionalism. I was at 400 feet. It was the pressure. Nitrogen narcosis, or more likely the high-pressure effects of heliox, HPNS, playing tricks on the brain. I saw things that weren't there. It was a risk of the job. But the whispers, the figures, the woman in the bank. Hallucinations, you need to rest, get some sleep. Decompression will take at least 48 hours. We have to get you out of saturation. I didn't argue anymore. He moved away from the window. I was left alone in my steel tomb, the food untouched. Was it possible? Had it all been a hallucination? The cold, the faces, the crack? It was the most logical explanation. But it didn't feel logical, it felt real. I tried to sleep. The cold of the lake seemed to have seeped into my bones. Despite the controlled heat in the chamber, I was still shivering. I bundled up in the rough blanket and closed my eyes. And then, I heard them again. Cold. So cold. The whisper wasn't in my ear or on the intercom. It was in the metal. The chamber itself was vibrating with the voice, as if the steel were speaking. I snapped my eyes open. The white light of the cabin was harsh, sterile. I was alone. Don't leave us. Don't leave us again. I sat up on the bunk. The terror was rising again. They weren't hallucinations. They were here. They had come up with me. Or perhaps they never needed to. They were in the water, and the chamber was surrounded by water in the barge's moon pool. They were connected to me. I started pounding on the wall. They're here, I can hear the voices. The supervisor's face reappeared at the window, his expression angry this time. Go to sleep, there is nothing there. You're stressed. They're going to up the O2 in your mix. It will calm you down. No, you don't understand. They're knocking on the hull. There is nothing. Our acoustic sensors aren't picking up anything but the barge's engines. You're jeopardizing the mission. Calm down, or I'll have to sedate you. He left. I was alone. I knew I wasn't crazy, but I also knew no one would believe me. I was becoming the madman in the pressure chamber, the diver who had cracked. I spent the next few hours in a terrifying vigil. The whispers came and went. Sometimes it was the child. Why are you warm? I want your warmth. Other times it was the woman from the bank. The director will be angry. You have to come back. You have to sign the register and the visions. The white walls of the chamber began to drip. I saw dark, filthy water running down the metal, even though the surface was dry. I saw dead algae growing in the corners. I saw the silt from the lakebed piling up at my feet. The drowned village was recreating itself around me, inside my steel prison. And in the reflection of the glass porthole, I didn't see my face. I saw the pale, bloated face of the man who had stared at me from the house. When the supervisor's face appeared again, I was huddled in the corner, shaking. He indicated there was a problem. The client had reviewed the initial report, the one I gave before the hallucination of the crack. The bank was located. The door was open. He didn't want to abort the mission. The contract stipulated that if the target was located, they had to make every effort to retrieve it. He wanted me to go back down. I refused. I'm not going back to that place. I'm not going back down into that grave. I yelled at him about the visions, the whispers. The supervisor listened patiently. All right, then we abort. but it will be on your head. Breach of contract. You'll lose your saturation license. No one will ever hire a diver who has a psychotic break at 400 feet. It was my career. He gave me an ultimatum. Either I went down and proved I could do my job, or my life as I knew it was over. But the worst part wasn't the threat to my career, it was the doubt. What if the supervisor was right? What if it had all been a helium-induced hallucination? If I refused to go down now, I would live the rest of my life never knowing if what I saw was real, or if I had simply gone insane. There was only one way to know. I had to go back. I had to face it. Okay, I'll go down, but if I hear or see anything at all, I'm aborting instantly. Get your gear ready, you're diving in 20. The second descent was worse than the first. I knew what was waiting. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the vibrations were carrying through the water. When the bell settled back onto the muddy cobblestones of the square, the silence of the town felt deafening. I stepped out into the water. The cold was the same. The town looked the same. But the feeling of being watched was 1,000 times more intense. They weren't just curious anymore. They were hostile. I moved down the main street, my heavy steps kicking up clouds of silt. The houses watched me. This time I saw no faces in the windows, but I knew they were there. The beam of my helmet light cut through the darkness. I reached the bank. The heavy metal door was still open just as I had left it. I stopped at the threshold. The inside was a pit of absolute darkness. I aimed my light inside. The silt, the marble counter, and the corner. The woman was no longer alone. She was there, in the same spot, her dark dress floating. But beside her was the child, and behind them more figures. The man from the house. 2 other men in old-fashioned suits. They were all clustered behind the counter like a grotesque receiving line, and they were all staring at me with their milky, empty eyes. They're here. I'm seeing at least 6 of them. They're in the bank. Silence on the line. Then the tense voice. Your helmet cam shows the interior is empty. There is nothing there. You're having another hallucination. Get back to the bell. We are aborting. No, I'm not running this time. I have to get to the vault. I advanced into the bank, pushing through the silt with my legs. The figures didn't move. They just followed me with their dead stares. The cold was unbearable. My hot water suit was struggling to keep me alive. I walked past them. They were so close I could have touched them. The smell of decay, of stagnant water, was overwhelming, even through my filters. I reached the vault door, on the other side of the counter. There it was, a circular steel door with a large wheel for a handle. I put my hand on the wheel. And then all the apparitions moved at once. They didn't attack me, they just drew closer, surrounding me. In an instant, I went from being alone in a large room to being in the center of an icy crowd. They encircled me, their pale bodies pressing against my suit, their waxen faces inches from my helmet. And then, they all began to whisper at once. The noise in my head was deafening. Thousands of voices all speaking over each other. Cold, hunger, silence. You have to stay. It's the rule. The water claims its own. You have to sign. Join us. Join. I screamed, stumbling back. And the woman, the one in the dark dress, raised her pale hand and pressed it against my helmet. The contact wasn't physical. I felt no pressure. I felt only cold. An absolute cold that overloaded my suit. My suit's internal temperature alarm began to blare in my ear, a high-pitched, desperate beep. And at the same time, my powerful helmet light flickered. Once, twice, and went out. I was in total darkness. Submerged at 400 feet, surrounded by a crowd of vengeful ghosts, blind and with my suit failing. I heard the supervisor's voice screaming my name in the communicator, but it sounded very, very far away. And the whispers were now inside my helmet. The darkness was total, absolute, and instantaneous. My world shrank to sound. The high-pitched beep of my suit's temperature alarm, meaning the extreme cold of the phantom contact, was winning, overloading the heating system. The roar of my own breathing, harsh and animalistic inside the helmet. And the whispers. Now that the light was dead, the whispers were no longer just in my head. They were in the water all around me, inside my communicator, drowning out the supervisor's voice screaming my name from the surface. The voices of the drowned were a chorus of ice. Stay. The register. Sign the register. The water reclaims its share, the cold is peace. I felt panic trying to paralyze me. I was blind 400 feet down in a flooded bank surrounded by a mob of malignant apparitions, and my suit was failing. My instinct told me to curl up, to give in. But the supervisor's voice, however distant, kept me anchored. They didn't touch me again. Not physically, but I felt their presences ringing me, a circle of cold that was tightening. I could feel them moving in the dark, their bodies subtly displacing the water around me. They were waiting for the cold to do its work, waiting for my heart to stop so they could claim me. I wasn't going to die here. I wasn't going to become another relic in their aquatic collection. I had to get out of the bank. I remembered the vault door at my back. The crowd of ghosts was in front of me, blocking the main exit to the lobby. I gripped the crowbar still hooked to my belt. I began to back up blindly, dragging my feet through the thick silt, pushing backward with my back against the vault door. I took a step, two, and then I hit something. Or rather, I passed through something. The sensation was indescribable. It was like walking through a curtain of dry ice. A cold so intense it burned my skin through the suit, and a torrent of choked whispers exploded in my head. I had walked through one of the apparitions. I screamed inside the helmet. The pain of the cold was blinding, but I kept pushing, striking out blindly with the crowbar in front of me, hitting the water, hitting those impossible pockets of cold. I heard them hiss when my bar passed through them. I got clear of the counter, back into the main lobby. I ran blindly toward where I remembered the exit was. I hit the stone doorframe. I reoriented and burst out into the square. The water in the square felt marginally warmer, or maybe just less concentrated with malice. But I was still blind. My umbilical, my lifeline. It was my only path back to the bell. I began to grope for it in the silt, my gloved hand fumbling. My fingers closed around the thick cable. Intense relief washed over me. I grabbed it. I began to pull myself along, hand over hand, dragging myself over the cobblestones away from the bank. The whispers became frantic. No, come back. The director is waiting, you can't leave. I felt tugs at my legs, the cold clinging to my boots. I kept pulling. I had to get to the light. I remembered the emergency chem light on my harness, a flare stick. I fumbled for it with my free hand, found it. I ripped it from its clip and bent it sharply. The sound of the glass vial breaking inside the plastic was crisp. I shook it. A faint, sickly green light illuminated the scene. And I wished I hadn't. The square was not empty. The entire community of the drowned village was there. Dozens of figures, men, women, children, all standing in the silt, motionless, watching me. Their bodies were pale, bloated, their century-old clothes plastered to their forms. And the woman from the bank was at the front, just 3 feet from me, blocking my path to the bell. Behind her, the diving bell was a bright yellow circle of safety, just 30 feet away. She raised her hand again, the same hand that had killed my light. The lake is patient, Martine, but its patience has a limit. We have chosen you. You will stay. The mob of ghosts began to advance, a silent wall of icy death closing in on me. My suit beeped again. The internal temperature was plummeting. I was freezing to death. They were winning. The cold was their weapon, and the cold was absolute. But my suit had one last defense, one I had never used. An emergency hot water flush. It was designed for a catastrophic heating failure in Arctic waters. It would dump a reserve of near-boiling water directly into the suit, a brutal thermal shock to restart the diver's circulation before an emergency ascent. It was dangerous. It could cause severe burns. But it was heat, and heat was life. The woman advanced, her pale fingers almost grazing my helmet. I closed my eyes and slammed the emergency activator on my chest. The pain was instant and total. It felt as if liquid metal was being poured inside my suit. An unbearable, searing heat flooded my chest, my arms, my legs. I screamed, a muffled sound of pure agony. The water inside my suit turned to steam, the pressure crushed me. But it worked. When I opened my eyes, heat was radiating from me like a small sun, and the apparitions recoiled. The heat, the life, the pure energy was anathema to them. Their pale faces contorted, not in anger, but in pain. They hissed like water on dry ice. The icy crowd broke, parting, backing away from the wave of heat rolling off me. I ignored the pain of my scalding skin. I lunged forward toward the bell. The woman tried to stop me, but when she reached out, the heat seemed to burn her phantom form. She dissolved in a silent scream. I reached the bottom hatch of the bell. I scrambled inside, slammed the hatch shut with a frantic turn of the wheel. I was safe. The metal interior of the bell was my refuge. "Get me up now, full emergency, get me up!" I felt the immediate pull of the winch. The bell began to rise. I curled up on the metal floor, the pain from the burns unbearable. But I was alive. I switched on the bell's internal light. I looked out the porthole, the one that wasn't cracked, the one only I knew was cracked. And down below in the darkness as I ascended, I saw them. The crowd of ghosts had regrouped in the square. They were standing, looking up, their pale faces fading into the blackness. They weren't following. They were just watching me go, and the woman from the bank was at the front. She raised her pale hand and slowly she waved. I said nothing during the long days of decompression. The supervisor never asked me again what I had seen. They found second-degree burns across my torso and legs when I came out of the chamber. The official story was a catastrophic failure of the suit's heating system. The mission was canceled. The safe is still down there. I quit the job. I couldn't go back in the water. I couldn't go back to the pressurized darkness. I moved away from the mountains, away from any lakes. I live in the desert now, where the heat is constant, where the air is dry, and where there is nothing deeper than the shadow of a rock. I won. I survived. But the lake kept something of mine. Sometimes at night, when the cold desert air comes through the window, I wake up shivering. And in the silence, I think I hear a whisper. Cold. It's so cold. And I know they're still there in their silent town waiting. The lake is patient. They didn't defeat me, but they didn't lose either. They just wait. And I know that a part of me, the fear, the cold in my bones, never left that flooded bank. The first hint that reality was fraying wasn't a loud noise, but a silence. Not just any silence, like the one that settles in an apartment at 3 a.m, but a silence with texture, a dense, absorbent silence that seemed to have its own weight. I first encountered it in a dream, one so vivid I could still feel its pressure on my eardrums when I woke up. I dreamed of a hotel. It wasn't a threatening place in appearance. On the contrary, it had an austere, geometric beauty. I called it the Hotel Opal in my mind, for the milky, pearlescent light that emanated from the walls and ceilings, a sourceless illumination that bathed the endless hallways in a constant, pale glow. The floors were of a veined, dark marble so deep it seemed to absorb the sound of my footsteps before they could be born. The walls were covered in a wallpaper with a subtle, almost imperceptible pattern that only revealed itself if you stared long enough. A labyrinth of lines that twisted and slowly changed shape, like seaweed in an invisible current. There were no windows, or if there were, they looked out onto other hallways, other identical interior courtyards, creating an architectural loop that defied all logic. The air smelled of ozone, damp marble, and old paper, a strange combination that struck me as both clean and decadent. It wasn't just the lack of sound. It was the very physics of the place that disturbed me in those first dreams. The hallways stretched out with perfect perspective, but if I walked down one for what felt like minutes, I'd sometimes find myself back at the starting point, without ever having turned. The staircases were visual traps. I could be at the top of a flight and simultaneously see the same staircase ascending from below, an Escher paradox made of marble and silence. The air was neither cold nor hot. It simply had no temperature, as if my nerves couldn't register it. And always, the feeling of being watched, not by eyes, but by the angles of the walls, by the curve of a vault. as if the architecture itself were a conscious entity, and I was an intrusive thought in its stone mind. At first, these dreams were just that, dreams, nocturnal explorations of an impossible place. I was a passive observer, a ghost drifting through empty corridors and lounges furnished with impeccable but impersonal taste. Dark velvet sofas, polished mahogany tables, lamps that gave no light. Everything was in its place, spotless, as if the hotel were waiting for guests who would never come. I never saw anyone, neither staff nor other visitors. The only presence was that of the building itself. I moved through its rooms with a detached curiosity, like a tourist in a perfectly preserved ruin. The problem started when fragments of the Hotel Opal began to leak into my waking life. The first time was subtle. I was in the kitchen making coffee, and for an instant, the hum of the refrigerator vanished, replaced by that dense, muffled silence from the dream. It lasted only a second, but it was enough to make the hair on my neck stand up. I blamed it on fatigue, but the incidents repeated, growing bolder. The smell of ozone and marble would assault me in the office elevator. The pattern on my bedroom wallpaper seemed, in a certain light, to twist with the same exasperating slowness as the one in the hotel hallways. I started having fleeting visions, memories of a life that felt like mine but turned strange upon examination. I remembered family dinners, but my parents' faces were smooth, blurry ovals, their voices a wordless murmur. A memory of a woman would hit me, a laugh in a park, the feel of her hand, but when I tried to hold onto her face, it dissolved into the opaline glow of the hotel. They were like faded photographs of a life that perhaps had never happened, and each failed memory left me more isolated, more unsure of the foundations of my own existence. I began developing rituals to anchor myself to reality. I counted my steps walking down the street, touched every lamppost, recited street names in my mind. They were desperate anchors thrown into a sea growing ever more foggy. My life, once orderly and predictable, shrank. Social interactions became a minefield. One day at the office, during a meeting, the invasion was total. My boss was talking in front of a presentation, but his voice reached my ears as a distant, distorted echo, drowned out by the hotel's silence that had settled in the room. The words on the screen began to tremble and reorganize. Where it should have read quarterly sales forecast, it now read the silence watches. I looked at my colleagues, searching for some sign that they saw it too, but their faces were fixed on the screen, attentive and serious. A cold sweat ran down my back. One of them asked me a question. I saw his lips move, but I only heard the ghostly, absent melody of the waltz from the hotel's ballroom. I nodded without understanding. A mask of normality plastered on my face while inside my mind was drowning. In a fit of desperation that same afternoon, I tried to make a call. The number was a vestige of a memory, the one of the woman with the laugh in the park. I dialed the digits on my cell phone with trembling fingers. The line rang, once, twice. Then there was silence. Not the silence of a dead line, but the dense, muffled silence of the hotel. I waited, my heart in my throat, and then I heard a voice. It was my own. "There's no one on the other side," my own voice said from the receiver with a terrifying calm I didn't feel. "You've always been alone here." I hung up, throwing the phone against the wall. The device didn't break. It just bounced softly off the drywall as if the wall were made of rubber, and fell without a scratch onto the carpet. I became obsessed. During the day, I tried to draw the hotel's floor plans in a notebook, trying to find some sense in it, an exit, a map of my own psyche. But it was impossible. Every night the layout changed. A hallway that once led to a grand lounge now ended in a wall of exposed brick. A spiral staircase that ascended towards the opaline light now descended into a basement flooded with black, stagnant water. The hotel was playing with me, reconfiguring itself to frustrate my understanding. I looked in the mirror, and the man staring back seemed a stranger, his tired eyes harboring a landscape of infinite corridors and a defeat I wasn't yet ready to admit. One night the dream changed. I was no longer an observer. I was in one of the rooms, registered as a guest. The room was an exact replica of my own bedroom, but with subtle and disturbing differences. The wood of the floor was darker, colder. The clothes in the closet weren't mine, but identical suits, all the same gray color. The window didn't look out onto the street, but onto another identical corridor of the hotel. On the nightstand was a heavy brass key with the room number engraved, 307. When I woke up sweating and with my heart racing, the key was in my hand. The solid metallic cold of the key was irrefutable proof. It wasn't a hallucination. I had brought an object from the dream world into the real world. Panic seized me. For hours, I tried the key in every lock in my house, knowing it was useless. It didn't fit any of them. I kept it in the bottom drawer of my dresser under old papers, hoping that by doing so I could contain the invasion, but it was too late. The membrane between my mind and reality had been torn irreparably. I began to fear sleep. I fought to stay awake, drinking liters of coffee, pacing my apartment all night like a caged animal. But exhaustion was a relentless enemy. I'd fall asleep on the sofa at my desk and instantly be transported back to the Hotel Opal. Now the hotel felt more hostile. The silence was no longer passive, it was expectant. I felt a constant gaze upon me, a cold intelligence observing me from the very walls. The shadows in the corners seemed to lengthen when I wasn't looking directly. Sometimes out of the corner of my eye I thought I saw a tall, thin figure at the end of a hallway, a faceless silhouette that vanished if I tried to focus on it. At times I saw other presences, more subtle, hunched figures polishing the already immaculate marble with synchronized, unnatural movements, never looking up, their forms shimmering like a heat mirage. They were the silent staff of a place that needed no maintenance. The lack of sleep made my days as surreal as my nights. Time stretched and shrank. Hours could pass in what felt like a blink, or a single minute could stretch into an eternity of anxiety. One day, leaving my building, I ran into a neighbor, an elderly woman who always greeted me kindly. That day, she stopped and looked at me with a completely empty expression, her eyes dull like frosted glass. Without a word, she turned on her heel and went back inside the building. Her behavior was so alien, so similar to the ghostly presences in the hotel, that I ran down the street aimlessly, my heart hammering in my chest. The true horror manifested when my waking spaces began to adopt the architecture of the dream. One Monday morning, heading to the kitchen, I found that the hallway in my apartment was longer than normal, much longer. My neighbor's doors had disappeared, replaced by the familiar labyrinth-patterned wallpaper. The wooden floor had transformed into the black, silent marble of the hotel. The sunlight that should have come from the living room was replaced by the sourceless opaline glow. I was in the hotel, but I was awake. Or so I thought. I screamed, but no sound came out of my mouth. The silence devoured it. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing it was a hallucination. When I opened them, I was back in my normal hallway. But the smell of ozone persisted, and on the floor by my feet was a fine layer of marble dust. This phenomenon, the false awakenings, became my personal torture. I'd wake up in my bed, relieved to have escaped the hotel, only to realize the room was the one from the dream, number 307. I'd struggle to wake up again and succeed, appearing this time in my real bedroom. But the feeling of unreality was so overwhelming I could no longer trust my senses. One morning I got up, showered, got dressed, and made breakfast. Everything seemed normal, painfully normal. I sat at the table, picked up the coffee cup, and as I brought it to my lips, the liquid turned into cold, black sand that spilled down my chin. The cup shattered in my hand, and I woke up for real, in my bed, my heart galloping. Which was the dream and which was waking life? Was I dreaming of the hotel, or dreaming of my life in the apartment? The question became a mantra, eroding the last vestiges of my sanity. Desperate, I decided to change tactics. If I couldn't escape the hotel, maybe I could understand it, master it. The next night, when I found myself standing in the grand lobby, I didn't run. I decided to explore with a purpose. If the hotel was a product of my mind, it must follow some kind of internal logic, the logic of a dream. I started walking, not randomly, but following the lines of the wallpaper pattern, as if it were a map. I tried to defy its rules. I took a coin from my pocket and used it to scratch a mark on the wallpaper. I walked to the end of the hall, and when I came back, the mark was gone. The wall was intact. The hotel repaired itself. My exploration led me to a corridor I hadn't seen before, one flanked by identical doors, each with a brass plaque. 307, mine. 308, 309. Fear mixed with a morbid compulsion. I opened the door to 308. Inside, a replica of my bedroom, but the painting on the wall was hung upside down. In 309, the bed was made with military precision, but covered in a fine layer of marble dust. In 310, all the books on the shelf had blank pages. Each room was a variation of my dreamed life, a discarded draft, a slightly flawed version. I was walking through the hotel's failed attempts to create a convincing reality for me. I wasn't a guest, I was the subject of an endless experiment, and these were the test cells. I arrived at the library. The shelves rose to a ceiling lost in gloom. Then I found the ballroom with its silent couples. I discovered the rooftop garden under its artificial sky. I saw the gardener pruning a crystal rose with shears that made no sound. Further on, I came across the indoor pool and its liquid black as oil. Peering in, I saw scenes from my life, my office, my city, viewed from a great distance as if they were someone else's memories. My wandering led me to the concrete wing with its flickering light. At the end of the corridor was the steel door, the peephole. I knew it was the end of the road. I stopped, listening. Through the thick metal, I heard the rhythmic breathing of someone asleep. With a fear that froze my blood, I approached and looked through it. What I saw shattered my mind into pieces. It was my apartment. It was me, asleep on the sofa, an expression of anguish on my face. I saw the incorrect details, the different painting, the book that wasn't mine. The truth hit me with the force of a cataclysm. My life was the dream. The Hotel Opal was the only reality. I was a consciousness trapped here, dreaming of being a man. For a moment, denial took hold of me. I beat the steel door with my fists. "Wake up!" I screamed at my other self. "Fight! Don't let it trap you!" But my fists made no sound against the metal, and my voice was a choked whisper, devoured by the silence of the corridor. My rebellion was useless, a pathetic gesture against an immutable truth. The panic gave way to a strange calm, a lucid resignation. The figure I saw through the peephole was a puppet. Its anxiety, its fear, its struggle for sanity were the echo of my own primal desperation, that of an entity trapped in this impossible architecture. How long had I been dreaming that life? Years, decades. How many times had I dreamed of being someone only to wake up again to this silent truth? I pulled my face away from the peephole. The flickering of the corridor light stabilized, becoming constant. The silence no longer felt oppressive, but familiar. It was the sound of my home. I turned and looked down the concrete corridor. It no longer seemed like a place of nightmare, but simply a place. My place. I walked back the way I had come. My perception had changed. I revisited the pool and understood they weren't images of my life, but the repository of all the dreams I'd had. The rooftop garden was my own creativity, crystallized and motionless. The blank books in the library were the infinite lives I had yet to dream. I began to speculate about the nature of the hotel. Was it a prison for lost consciousnesses? A reality-generating engine? Or simply the physical form of solitude, a structure built from the void? The questions had no answers, and I realized it didn't matter. I found myself back in the grand lobby. Behind the reception desk, where no one had ever been before, now stood the silhouette. Tall, thin, faceless. It moved, not to look at me, but to gesture with a pale hand towards a hallway that opened to its right, a hallway I would swear wasn't there before. I understood it was an invitation. I was no longer a terrified guest, lost in a dream. I was a resident who had finally remembered his address. I walked towards the desk. The faceless figure stepped back, blending into the shadows. Behind the counter was a large ledger open. It was filled with names, dates, dreamed lives. The last entry was almost complete. with my dreamed name. Only a signature was missing. I didn't sign it. I closed the book gently. The sound of the leather covers coming together was the first real noise I'd heard in a long time. A definitive sound. The period at the end of a story. I walked away from the desk and began to walk down one of the endless marble hallways. I was no longer looking for a way out. What for? You can't escape yourself. The opaline light enveloped me like a silk shroud. The silence cradled me. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt a kind of peace. The struggle was over. I had accepted the architecture of my soul. As I walked, I noticed my hands becoming translucent, my body lighter. The process was gradual. First, I lost my sense of touch. The cold marble under my feet became an idea, not a sensation. Then my ability to form thoughts into words dissolved, replaced by a purely geometric understanding of space. My sight didn't fade, but expanded, losing its focal point until I could perceive all the corridors and rooms simultaneously. My reflection in the polished marble floor slowly faded, until only the image of the corridor, perfect and empty, remained. I was becoming part of the hotel, another of its silent presences. Perhaps my new purpose would be to observe the next dreamer, the next consciousness that would fabricate a life on the outside to avoid facing the truth of its own lonely inner eternity. Or perhaps, simply, I would become silence, the weight and texture of the stillness that waits patiently at the end of all dreams.